Playoffs is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we will be reviewing number 14, Gustav Nyquist. Now, it was actually somewhat of a tough decision whether or not I wanted to review Nyquist's performance as a Shark, because obviously he was traded at the deadline to the Sharks, so he only actually played 19 regular season games and then the entirety of the playoffs. But because Nyquist actually had a pretty big role with the Sharks, he was mostly in their top 6, I decided to review him anyway. So when it came to a player like Michael Haley, who would necessarily be up next at number 18, I will not be reviewing him because, his role with the team really wasn't much and he didn't play that many games. And so Nyquist's frequent line mates with the Sharks, of course, was Kane and Hurdle, mostly during the regular season. Still had a good amount of time with Meier and Couture, who he spent the majority of the playoffs with. Of course, as I've mentioned in previous videos, once Pavelski got injured in Game 7 against the Golden Knights, Nyquist was bumped up to the top line with Meier and Couture, and that actually was a pretty successful line in the playoffs, at least in the Colorado series, not so much necessarily in the series against the Blues, which is the one the Sharks ended up losing. In the regular season with the Sharks, of course not considering anything that happened with the Red Wings, he had 19 games, 6 goals, 5 assists for 11 points. Not too bad for a trade deadline acquisition. Obviously, you're a player who's expected to, get acclimated with a new system and team and teammates and everything like that. Basically by the next day, I believe the Sharks had a game against the Bruins the day after the deadline, if I'm not mistaken, and so it is certainly a tall task to actually be able to get acclimated. I mean, people pointed to Erik Karlsson, who was traded for in about mid-September, and he needed a good month to 2 months just to actually get used to the team and get up to speed. And so with someone like Nyquist, the fact that you're asking him to do that basically by the next day makes it more excusable that he would have 11 points in 19 games, which is actually still relatively solid. His plus-minus was a decent +1, so at least he wasn't minus. The main issue with Nyquist was his power play points. He only had a single one, and of course Nyquist didn't really get much time, if any, with the first power play unit, but he still did have about 2 minutes of power play ice time per game during the regular season, and the fact that in those 19 games he was only actually be able to contribute into a single power play goal was a bit disappointing. For the time on ice, 15 minutes and 34 seconds as he slotted right into that top 6. He was the top 6 forward with the least amount of even strength ice time, but that's not really too much of a surprise when you're DeBoer and you're maybe down a goal or you're up a goal and you're trying to hold a lead / come back into a game. It's not really a surprise that you're probably going to rely on players who you've had for a lot longer. So, with the goalie pulled, maybe you're sending out Couture, Pavelski, Kane, Hurdle, players who you've seen, you know what they can do, they can come up clutch, compared to someone like Nyquist, who maybe you've only had for a couple of weeks on the team. Into the playoffs, 20 games played, so he played the full time. Only 1 goal, which was somewhat disappointing, but still a relatively solid 10 assists for 11 points. As I said, he was a pretty a decent part of that top line. Maybe he wasn't as good as Meier and Couture. He was probably the lowest performing member, but he still definitely pulled his weight. He wasn't sort of like an anchor on that line. A similar +1, so still nothing negative defensively. But now in the playoffs, he only had 0 power play points. Now his power play ice time during the playoffs was only about a minute and a half, so a good 30 seconds left to less than what he had in the regular season. But still, with the power plays being so, I guess, rare in the playoffs compared to in the regular season, and the fact that the Sharks at times did struggle on the power play, you would have liked to see Nyquist be able to contribute a bit more. What's also interesting was his time on ice, that actually remained basically the same, only going down 1 second. But as I've said in multiple of my other reviews, is that in the playoffs you'd expect it to go up because of the amount of more ice time that there is to go around, considering the fact that there are overtimes that can go 20 plus minutes, as the Sharks did multiple times, and considering Nyquist played in every single game, you'd expect him to actually have benefited from that. But instead, his even strength ice time went slightly down. As I said, his power play ice time went down. His even strength ice time went up a bit, but his power play ice time dropped a bit too much, so it remained the same. Again, it's not too much of a surprise. You'd expect DeBoer to go with the tried and true that he knows, compared to someone like Nyquist, who was a bit new to the team, especially in the playoffs, where it's very important to actually know what you're going to get out of specific players. So again, not a huge surprise, but it is interesting to make note of. For grades, of course, the first 3 quarters with the Sharks Gustav Nyquist was not there, and I have no idea how he performed with the Detroit Red Wings. But in the fourth quarter, so the 19 games he did play, I gave him a B, as I thought he was actually relatively impressive. And in the playoffs, even if it was only a single goal, I still thought he was a pretty decent part of that top line with Meier and Couture. And as such, my final grade for Gustav Nyquist is the grade of a B. I thought he was a pretty solid trade deadline acquisition. The Sharks were certainly better with him than they were previously without him. And so it was a nice push from Doug Wilson. It didn't really cost all too much in terms of draft picks. So I'd like to, if the Sharks had a do-over, if Wilson had a do-over, I'd like for him to make the same move again. Class dismissed.